We will go ahead and get started with our panel discussion. One of the things that we talked about is allowing our subcommittees to have a little more time on some of the agendas for our line commission meetings moving forward. So that is this panel is a result of that. So for this meeting, the Research, Demonstration, Development, and Deployment Subcommittee, which is chaired by Dr. Peters, has organized a panel. John Kotek will be taking the lead on this panel for Dr. Peters. So, John?
It can't be, there we go. It couldn't be because I'm too soft-spoken. All right, so appreciate the opportunity to be here with you this morning. Let me just tee this up a little bit. So we'll start by talking about the versatile test reactor, which you heard a little bit about this morning. Wanted to take the opportunity to take a little deeper dive into the VTR. Just by way of kind of framing for this discussion, one of the primary roles for the Energy Department and its national laboratories is to provide what are often called big science tools, right, for use by the research community, whether it's folks in the labs, in industry, in the university community, even sometimes international partners. And these are really tools for advancing the state of knowledge across a wide range of fields that are too large for, say, an educational institution to take on its own, or for a private company to take on its own. These are things that the government builds because they contribute, they're a public good, they contribute to the advancement of our society or our economy. So you'll see things at other laboratories, particle accelerators, supercomputers, for example, that serve these roles. Here at Idaho, of course, we've got the Advanced Test Reactor and the nuclear science user facilities that involve a wide range of facilities across the country, but kind of centered here at Idaho and the ATR. And so, the VTR is what would be the kind of the next big tool in the nuclear energy and neutron science field. And I have with me here this morning three outstanding panelists to talk about what is the VTR, what's the path forward, what would it be used for, and a wide range of questions. I want to start by just passing the microphone down and asking the panelists to introduce themselves. Briefly, we've got Tom O'Connor here from the Office of Nuclear Energy in DOE's Office of Nuclear Energy. Bob Boston, of course, who you heard from DOE's Idaho Operations Office, and then John Baumgartner here from the Idaho National Laboratory. So Tom, if you'd explain a little bit about your background and about your role with the VTR, please.
Thank you, John. My name is Tom O'Connor. I have 36 years of nuclear energy experience, initially with building, operating, and regulating for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, commercial nuclear power plants. My initial time with the Department of Energy was with the isotope program, building and maintaining isotope production facilities. And since the 2005 timeframe, I've had responsibility for the Advanced Reactor Research and Development Program, which includes fast reactors, the high temperature gas-cooled reactors, and now the emerging molten salt reactors. And my new responsibilities are as the VTR program director to oversee the entire project, as well as provide the interfaces with other departmental organizations, as well as members of Congress and the administration. Thank you.
And in 1999, I went to work for DOE. I've basically done almost every job in the Idaho Ops Office, budgeting, finance, regulatory. My forte was nuclear and radiation safety. Spent several years in oversight of operations, and most recently in the regulatory oversight. And then, as I stated in January, I was assigned as the operations office manager. I was also fortunate about that time to be given the opportunity to be the licensing official, the authorization official for the VTR. So that'll be a huge opportunity for me and for the Department of Energy. And my role in the VTR is I provide the staff, the regulatory staff for the licensing, as well as the project staff to assist Tom. So.
All right. So, John Baumgartner. So I joined the Army when I was 17. Got out of the Army and set chokers logging. And after those two things, I decided maybe college would be a good idea. So got a degree in mechanical engineering technology, and then entered the nuclear industry at N-Reactor. So from N-Reactor to South Texas Project, high flux isotope reactor, I've had the opportunity to hold a fairly wide variety of positions, everything from senior reactor operator, or and certified operator, to work control center manager, outage manager, and so on. So it's certainly been quite the journey. Recently had the opportunity to come to Idaho in order to lead the restart of TREAT. So TREAT's now operating, and over the span of the last year, I've not been involved in it, but they've actually set a record. More transients in 1 year than has ever been performed. And that's an indicator of the value and the deployment of that new facility right here in Idaho. So currently I'm the VTR project manager, and my responsibility currently is getting the structure set up in order to do the conceptual design, and and currently I'm the design authority. I'll retain that authority until we get some more staff. As you heard, staffing's a challenge, and so we're working on that.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So let me start by just sort of framing just what is this thing, okay? So the versatile test reactor, what does that mean? What role might it play? What gap would it try to fill? And Tom, let me turn to you on that one.
Thank you. The reactor that's under consideration is one that would provide high spectrum, high energy neutrons for doing fuels and materials irradiations. And then the next logical question might be, well, how does that compare or differ from what is currently going on within the ATR? Fundamentally, there is no difference. They both would serve as a source of neutrons. The ATR is a thermal spectrum neutron, so think very low energy levels of neutrons, whereas the VTR would be in the million electron volts and higher spectrum. And what that affords us is an opportunity to provide an irradiation tool and an environment that would simulate the kinds of neutron fluences that some of the generation of advanced reactors currently under development would need to see. And with those capabilities, they would be able to perform experiments to, in essence, qualify materials and fuels so that the designers have the information upon which they can design their reactors in as conservative a manner as possible, but also as cost effectively as possible. But it would also provide the kind of information that the regulators would need to ensure that as the designers are working on their designs, that they have the kind of safety basis, that they meet the safety basis. So it's a very important tool from not only the designers, but also from a regulatory structure.
Super. Great. Thanks, Tom. So with that in mind, John, if you wouldn't mind, talk a little bit about the results of the current planning for the technology selection. What do you envision this thing looking like in terms of capabilities, et cetera?
John, it's actually very similar to reactors that have operated here on site in the past. EBR-1 was really the sort of the grandfather for this reactor, and it's quite similar to EBR-2. The fuel design itself looks very similar. The intent is to use sodium, and so it's a sodium-cooled fast reactor. And it's there's been a tremendous amount of work done actually domestically after the EBR2 was built. So the way it would look then is very similar to the PRISM reactor. And maybe getting ahead on this, so I'll stop right there, sorry. So, but that would be the technology. It's really quite similar to the EBR2. It does use metal. That certainly is an important attribute for from a safety standpoint.
Okay, great. And just a quick follow-up on that. One of the issues that we hear raised about other potential reactor developments on the site is water use. One of these sodium is that. Talk a little bit about use of water in a reactor type like this, if you would.
The coolant being sodium is in the primary system. That requires no water whatsoever. In the secondary system, the coolant is sodium as well, and the heat exchange is via a sodium to air heat exchanger. And so essentially no water is used except for, fundamentally support of the people that are in the facility.
Great, appreciate it. If I could, Bob, let me turn to you. So DOE, of course, goes through a process when it's looking to construct and site a major facility like this. One of those things, of course, being deciding where they want to build it, right? And one of the things that informs that decision is an environmental analysis. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that process works and where we are in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. Just this week, we brought in a subcontractor to the Department of Energy, and Tom was here to be part of those discussions. And so that subcontractor is looking at the NEPA process. And I didn't attend those meetings, so I'm going to turn that over to Tom. And
so from an environmental impact statement, we will explore alternatives, and the mechanism is an opportunity for environmental considerations to be provided to the selecting official to ensure that as the federal government makes, in essence, a very, very major decision, spending the kind of money for VTR, that he understands, or she, the kinds of environmental impacts that may arise based on those selections or those alternatives. So they look at jobs, they look at impacts to the environment, they look at impacts on people, near-term, long-term, transportation, a whole host of things. So relative to the alternatives, that's what we're in the process of exploring at this point in time. Obviously, an alternative for the selection for VTR is here at the Idaho National Laboratory, but to, in essence, comply with the requirements of the environmental impact statement process, we have to look at other sites as possible alternatives. And some of those alternatives being considered, at least at this point in time, might be the Oak Ridge National Laboratory or the Savannah River National Laboratory or the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory out at Hanford. Some of the things that will go into that is, obviously the reactor, but for us, a key piece to it, as Bob showed on the slides, is what is the post-irradiation examination capabilities. And so that's a piece of, what is the existing infrastructure at a location, and that will have a heavy influence on, the ultimate selection.
Very good. So thinking down the road a little bit, John, you touched earlier on the PRISM design. For those who don't know, that was a sodium-cooled fast reactor design that General Electric pursued with government support back in the 80s, 90s, but even into the aughts in more recent years. Can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about using that past experience to build on with the VTR?
Okay, let's try this one. The PRISM design actually evolved from 1984 to 1994. There was about $1 billion spent on the development of this design. And as it turns out, because that design leveraged the information that was available from EBR2, FFTF, and some international experience, it represented the state of the art at the time. As it turns out, the state of the art in this type of reactor is, they pretty much achieved it. So we're able to leverage those development efforts just directly. The specific model that we're leveraging is called the Mod A, and that was finalized in approximately the 1994 timeframe. And that would include the design for the reactor vessel, the reactor vessel auxiliary cooling system, which is a air cooling system that's used for decay heat removal, and essentially everything within the reactor vessel, so the primary coolant pumps, the intermediate heat exchangers, and so on. We're using a large amount of that information directly, and so the vessel itself, we believe, will not require modification. We can use perhaps not the precise design EM pumps, but really quite similar. The original Mod A was designed for 471 megawatts thermal, and we're anticipating that this plant, the VTR, will be 300 megawatts thermal. And so we're not going to scale things down in most cases. So it's clear that that size was a great size to start with. One of the big differences, though, is that we don't attempt to generate electricity with it. And so certainly in terms of an expedited acquisition and then its research mission, the choice was to simply use the sodium dare heat exchanger. So those are the primary attributes and how we intend on leveraging it. One of the key points, I think, is we are reaching out to the industry, the contractors that actually were involved in the design of the prism in the first place, and we're leveraging their knowledge as well. So it's not just the information, it's also the people that were involved in the development.
Super. So that kind of frames the project for you. Let me ask now, any questions from the commission before I dig in a little bit further? Director Tippett.
Madam Chairman and panel, I appreciate the comments. Sounds like a very interesting project. I guess a couple of questions. First of all, I'm wondering if it's anticipated that research done using the VTR would potentially involve spent commercial fuel, and if so, does the current situation in Idaho that prohibits quantities of spent nuclear fuel from coming into the state, would that impact the decision as to whether or not the project would be constructed in Idaho?
The question, currently there's no intent to use reprocessed spent nuclear fuel. There is, it will use some form of HALEU, but the fuel is in development, and so the short answer to your question is no, we won't use spent nuclear fuel, nor do we intend to bring in SMF from outside of the state for this.
Thank you.
Chairman. I have two questions. One is, have any preliminary risk assessments been done of this design of a probabilistic nature? And if so, what are those looking like? That's question one. And then question two is, I'm interested in, have you thought about disposition of the fuel or disposition of any waste that might result from this reactor?
With respect to the risk assessment that's been, there was there's new Reg 1368 that was issued by the NRC, specifically looking at the risks associated with this reactor, and that was a preliminary safety analysis report. That's actually the only one, to the best of my knowledge, that the NRC has issued to this point on an advanced reactor, and they hold that it's essentially valid to this day. Subsequent work did involve development of a probabilistic risk assessment. That was some work that was funded by the Department of Energy, I believe under the GNEP program, but fairly recently, in any event, approximately 6 or 7 years ago. And at that time, the assessment was done on the PRISM reactor. And so it's a very recent PRA that was done on this reactor type. So we're able to leverage all that information, and we are doing that. We are developing the safety basis using PRA techniques in order to classify safety systems, for example, and we're using, and that's part of the licensing modernization approach that we're deploying.
Regarding your second question, as far as waste disposition, as part of the NEPA process and the EIS, as well as the DOE authorization or licensing process, we have to look cradle to grave, which is different from what DOE did in the 50s and 60s. So we haven't made a decision on ultimate fuel disposition, but it's something we take seriously, and we'll be looking into that as we move forward. Since it'll look a lot like EBR2 fuel, you could speculate on a disposition path for that. So,
Director Keeley.
On the figure on the website, there's the advanced reactors industry has the different advanced reactor types, and there are 7 types, and there's 5 that are scheduled to sort of mature, I guess, be available for commercialization mid-2020s, late 2020s. This would be an additional, I call it product, but unique to as a research tool. But will it take away or impact any of the target dates for these other products that are scheduled to come on stream? And again, is there enough talent to make certain everything happens?
Thank you. So I would draw a parallel to where we are today with the commercial light water industry, the Navy's nuclear program, and their reliance on the advanced test reactor. So while we've been operating light water-based reactors for many, many years, we continue via the capabilities at ATR and other science and research to advance and further perfect those designs. So relative to VTR and the timing of it and the deployment of these other advanced reactors, I would say that there is no impact, but at the same time, they will benefit from its subsequent operation to ensure that those designs continue to progress as they learn information, that they will build upon it. So VTR, although not ready now for them, they will nonetheless benefit and use from it. And relative to the talent, all of the talent is not here at the Idaho National Laboratory. I know that's probably blasphemy here in this room, so I may need an escort to leave. But I think that it's important that we have something that is very demonstrated. It's almost like buying a house. You see a field, the developer has all these lots there, but what is the attractive nature for prospective buyers? Well, if you have a model, if you have something there, then it makes it that much more attractive. And I draw that parallel for students looking to enter into the nuclear industry or the energy industries. By having something that they can come and see and kick the tires on, that sparks their interest and further promotes the attractive nature of getting these kids into colleges, whether it's here in Idaho or elsewhere.
When I used to think about reactors, and I used to think about new ones and managing, and they were always in, this is the order of difficulty, they get harder. The technical risk is the easiest, the licensing risk is second, and then the financial risk is third. And in a government system, the financial risk becomes a political risk. It's complicated. So I'm interested from all of you in the panel in discussing those things. On the technical side, I would assume the longest pole in the tent is the fuel development and testing, and you got to get somebody to make it, but I may be wrong. On the licensing risk, it sounds to me, Bob, like this is going to be a DOE licensed reactor. That's the vision. And I'm interested in why you chose that as opposed to an NRC licensed test reactor. And third, and Tom and John Kotek, you can weigh in on this. How big a lift is this, roughly, and relative to the current Department of Energy budgets? And, we know from the science and engineering community this is like the holy grail, a fast test reactor, and oh my gosh, the Russians and the Chinese have them, we don't. Everybody else is advancing the state of the art and we're not, and those concerns are real. But on the commercial side, there's certainly no pull for a commercial fast reactor, but there's always a pull for new technologies. So I'm interested in how you guys see the financial and political risks too associated with such a project. So again, technical, licensing, and financial, political.
John, I'll cover the technical risk side. One of the strategies for this reactor was to minimize the technology risk associated with the reactor by using proven technology in essentially everything. For example, the fuel choice that we have for the reactor has sufficient information that it is licensable right now. So that was one of the primary attributes we were looking for with respect to the fuel, because a single fuel test in the end could take up to 5 years, and we just don't have the time to do new development activities. So fortunately, we have plenty of data for a fuel type that works very well for this reactor. So that's an example. You did mention, fuel specifically. But when you look at the other technologies and you look at how the commercial industry is struggling today with some of the construction, it's because of some of the technologies they select. For example, when you look at a fully digital instrument and control system or reactor protection system, that's something that from a regulatory standpoint is very hard. So what we're going to do is what we're proposing now, as part of the conceptual design, is an analog reactor protection system, but a modern one that is very reliable and has very low drift. And as a matter of fact, interestingly, Curtis Wright here locally in Idaho Falls has a modern analog safety system, and they're actually assisting with developing a design, to deploy that. When you look at the balance of the technology that's associated with the plant, it's very straightforward, and that's by design. So it's a very simple plant. It's not pressurized, and so when you look at even the technology associated with manufacturing, it's fairly low tech. And the reactor vessel and guard vessel are actually more like building tanks rather than, just a storage tank, rather than, building a vessel, because it's very thin material, compared to a PWR. So now in the part of the plant that is complicated technically is the experiments. But the thing is that those are easily controlled. You make a bounding condition for it, and then you get state-of-the-art results out of it. So any questions on technology?
Is the manufacturing of the fuel going to be an issue for you?
We've looked at that extensively, and we believe not, because of the very great experience here on site with manufacturing the fuel. We don't anticipate making major changes to the manufacturing of the fuel compared to what's been done in the past. So it'll be a cast fuel. Part of the reason for doing it that way is if we use any other technique, then we potentially invalidate the experimental results that we can leverage today.
Regarding licensing risk, we've got great experience on site, being able to work with the contractor to work through difficult technical issues, and lots of experience. When the lab was consolidated from other programs, secretarial offices, other DOE programs, we took over some facilities that had a legacy. We call them documented safety analysis. I'll just call them licenses for ease of determination that didn't meet standards. So we spent 10 years, mostly because of funding, but not because of effort, getting those up to speed. And then the next dry run was the treat reactor. As I said, the treat license had not been touched since 1992. Effectively, it was a shutdown facility, and we had to completely rewrite the treat license, and we did that successfully. John and I actually worked together on that, and we did that in 18 months. And because of that success, the other DOE site areas have reached out to us for what is our success. And I'll tell you the difference between us and the NRC that I can say that the risk is minimized as far as licensing is we don't do requests for information. My staff know that if they have a question, either walk over to John's office or pick up the phone and ask, or ask for a presentation. We're not going to be in critical path. Now, that's not to say that if there's a safety issue, we won't hold the contractor to task. There was, John can attest, there was lots of meetings where we shut the door and had very difficult technical discussions, and were able to work through the issues to come to a safe resolution. So we're not above that, but I expect my staff to work through their issues with the contractor, move forward, not delay the project schedule. My licensing staff are also just down the hall from the project staff, so they're very aware of what the schedule is. And now, as far as the biggest licensing risk that I foresee is lack of qualified technical individuals. My background is light water reactors, not sodium fast reactors. And so we recognize that risk. In June, we've got a highly qualified subcontractor that's going to come in and start providing us sodium fast reactor training. And we'll continue that training throughout the process until the reactor, if it does come to Idaho, is started up. And then, rather than staff up a large cadre of federal staff that we will have to release when the project's over, or we're going to direct a DOE subcontract the appropriate individuals, either from the labs or other smart individuals in chemistry, mechanics, physics, whatever. We'll bring in the right individuals, and they'll be under direct DOE contract to us to work through that licensing process. So we've given a lot of thought about it. Last fall, we, as part of the DOE process, the first part is the safety expectations letter. I signed that out to John. It's about a 5-page letter detailing what my safety expectations are. Post Fukushima, which in my mind was close to criminal, for that to occur, I told John we will not have an off-site release from any type of reactor like that, and we've had a lot of discussions about what does that mean, and that went into the safety expectations letter. We just are about to release the safety and design letter, and then there's various parts of the licensing process in the DOE vernacular that we're working through. We tend to work with John in the lab to meet those schedules. Again, not to presuppose the EIS. So.
One of the key points about this process is that the Department of Energy is an extremely rigorous regulator. On the contractor side, I have to say the responsiveness is exceptional, and what that means is that the beatings occur real time.
Relative to licensing, I guess I just might also add that, it's the initial legislation that established the Department of Energy and its predecessors gives us the authorization to do it. That said, the Department of Energy over the past several years has been working with industry and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to, in essence, translate the light water requirements that the NRC has into requirements associated with advanced reactor technology. And in conjunction with them starting to establish that, and all based on work that the labs have provided to them, and including work with the Nuclear Energy Institute, we're going to be incorporating some of those modern thinking in terms of it. So the question of PRA was addressed. So that's something that we're actively working on, incorporating PRA into the design aspects. And then lastly, we do have a memorandum of understanding signed with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, so that in the event that we need to reach out to them and gain some assistance, we have that ability. And it's also an opportunity for the NRC to watch what it is that we're doing to facilitate their subsequent licensing of any advanced reactors in the future. In regards to the questions on TRL level, that kind of plays into the other question that you asked, John. And that is that with a high TRL level, you have a high confidence of the design And with the high confidence in the design, you are then better able to more accurately predict costs and schedules. And going to your point relative to how heavy of a lift this is, it's going to be very difficult to begin with. But if we come back, in a year or 2 years' time and say, well, we missed our mark by 25% or 50%, then that's the death knell for a project like this. The cost that we've ranged for this at the mission needs statement aspect of the project. So when we move through these capital acquisition projects within the Department of Energy, we first have, in this case, the Deputy Secretary established that, yes, we do have a need for this capability. And based on some initial analysis, we give him not only what the need for it is and what we would do with it, but we tell him what the cost and schedule for it is. And right now, we have outlined that the projected costs for this project are between $3 and $6 billion. So he made the decision that said, yes, we need this, knowing that we have this extensive cost range. And I would say, yes, that is a big lift, but knowing that we have the Nuclear Energy Innovations Capabilities Act, which advocates for such a capability, knowing that in 2017, 2018, 2019, that we've received significant increases from Congress over the request that the President put in, also reflects strong congressional support for this project. And then I guess lastly, as we internally develop our budgets, we provide budgets to the President and we get what they refer to as passback. Well, the number that we provided compared to the number that we got back, was significantly more than what we had asked for. So that reflects a strong administration support for this. With that support, though, it's going to be incumbent upon John and the Idaho folks and the rest of us to hit our milestones, to hit our marks, to ensure that we're living up to their expectations and can justify why it is that we're doing this.
One of the factors that we've looked at with respect to accomplishing this program is the concept of the best athlete. And so if the industry can do the work the best, then we would like the industry to do it. If it's the laboratories, then the laboratories. And the same with the universities. So this provides a unique opportunity for us to essentially look across the country and find the combination of what are the best athletes in each one of those areas, whether it's the core safety reactor design or on the experiment side, and to engage a very broad community. So at this point we have 5 laboratories actively engaged. We have 6 industry firms that are major and a number of smaller subcontracts, especially with key folks like General Atomics, TerraPower, and so on. And then at this point we have subcontracts with 12 universities, and we anticipate getting another 6 more. And it's not a coincidence that they happen to pretty much blanket the country.
Excuse me. Admiral Grossenbacher raised mentioned other countries, and that got me thinking. In previous conversations, the Line Commission has talked about the 100-year relationship that the United States can have with other countries when we develop, sell, and then service nuclear power technologies. I know that this is not that. This is not nuclear power. But can you just maybe talk a little bit about the international opportunities, implications of having the VTR, what the customer base might look like, what the relationships might look like, not just technically speaking, but in that larger sense of the, I guess, involving the United States in enhancing our stature globally when it comes to nuclear leadership.
So from that perspective, the United States has had fast reactor technology deployed previously. John mentioned EBR-1, EBR-2. We've had Fermi-1, a plant outside of Detroit. Globally, Japan has 2 fast reactors, Joyo, which is their test reactor, which is currently shut down, Monjo, which is a commercial scale, which is being decommissioned. France had Phoenix and Super Phoenix. The Chinese have a small test reactor that was designed for them by the Russians. The Russians have Bore 60, and they are also developing MBIR. They have two commercial reactors operating, BN 600, BN 800, and of course India has some too. Relative to international collaborations and cooperations, we are in the process of developing memorandums of understanding, with Korea, with Japan, and with France, so that we can work with them to understand things that we should factor into the design, to take advantage of their operational experience, to collaborate with them on the development of experiments, and perhaps instrumentation. So given that Japan doesn't have one, that Korea does not have one, that France does not have one, who are some of the leading developers of nuclear technology, and with these memorandums, we see a long-term relationship being established. And you may say, well, what about China and Russia and India? Well, they have their various political challenges ahead of us. Where will that be in the future? It's uncertain. But I don't think that we want to wait until the political winds have died down to be able to take leadership in this particular area. We don't want to have to wait for them. And along those lines, I think it's also very important that as we move forward with this project, that we move forward with it based on U.S. funding, U.S. leadership, U.S. design, U.S. regulations to establish this capability as soon as we can. We don't want to have to be beholden to them, for instance, like ITER. It has the potential, when you're relying on somebody else for funding, to drag out. Lord knows it's going to be challenging enough to get the money as it is. Why further complicate that?
Any other questions for our panelists? Okay, if not, any other closing observations the panelists would like to offer for the commission?
I'd like to point out the contributions that, I'd mentioned the experiment development that's going on right now. And the University of Idaho is doing research on the advanced molten salt flow sensors. So that was one of the applications we received and granted. And so they're actively engaged with the, I'd mentioned how some of the experiments are really quite complicated and cutting edge. Well, University of Idaho is certainly contributing to that. And that's in the pretty rarefied atmosphere when you look at the other folks that are involved. MIT, for example, is doing advanced data acquisition and simulation with live data. And there's, of course, the other 12 that I won't go into, but I thought that might be of interest to the panel.
Just lead the panel or the commission with the thoughts that, our intent is to be an excellent steward of the taxpayers' money, be a successful project, do it well costed, again, below cost and on schedule. And also, as far as safety, we expect the safest reactor in the world. There'll never be a safety issue with this reactor, assuming it comes to Idaho, and so we'll make that commitment to you.
I guess I want to thank you for the opportunity to give you some insights into this, and look forward to giving you real updates in the future as to the success that we're making.
John, I think we had one more question. Paul.
Sorry, I thought there was going to be more on the VTR, and so I was going to wait till the end. But I appreciated the opportunity yesterday to go out to the site. I'd never been out there before. This is all very new to me. I sit here and some days feel very dumb, but I appreciate this information. As we were in the ATR, first of all, Paul Arrington with the Idaho Water Users. I haven't met all of you before. As we were in the ATR, we were up on the catwalk overlooking the canal, and as I am wont to do, we started talking about the water rights of the laboratory and some of the uses that go on out at the site. And so I guess I have two questions. This VTR, is it going to use water? And do you know, if it is, how much? And then number two, maybe even more my question. How, when you have new projects like this that may use water, how do you consider what your water rights are, what they authorize in that grand picture of these new projects? Thank you.
Paul, thanks for the question. Certainly water is an important consideration. For this particular plant, we don't anticipate using water in any of the major processes, for heat removal. So, for example, because sodium is the coolant, we don't use water as a coolant, so there's not a throughput of water from that standpoint. When it comes to cooling the reactor on the secondary system, it's not necessary to have a cooling tower where you essentially spray water through it either. The way that we remove the heat from the reactor is a direct exchange from the sodium secondary through essentially radiators to the atmosphere. And so it's very low water usage. As a matter of fact, it's potable water usage, things like that will really be the primary use of water in this facility. So I have a legal staff and environmental staff that advise me on the water rights that the Department of Energy has with the state, and I don't have the number on the tip of my tongue, but we're significantly below what our rights uses are. But every time a new project comes on site, we evaluate that. We talk to the state, and you may or may not. You may be aware that the decision was made for the UAMPS NuScale reactor. They'll have to pursue their own water rights. They can't ride upon ours, and so that decision was made. So, in short answer, yes, we evaluate all new projects and what the impacts are on our existing water rights. Thank you. Yeah.
And I guess to follow up on that, as a part of the environmental impact statement process, water usage is one of the key pieces of those things considered. So in light of the fact that we don't have it, it is nonetheless something that is addressed.
Merle, this will be the last question.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chairman. Primarily for Bob and Tom, I know you guys know that there are federal regulatory agencies like OSHA, like the NRC, that have, and they use different terminology, but they're fundamentally agreement states. So if your OSHA safety program is good enough, then OSHA recognizes that that state regulates itself essentially in safety. The NRC does some of that, obviously not with reactors, but with some nuclear activities. Now, I'm not proposing that Idaho become a reactor licensing entity, but I would suggest and ask that you think about, part of the challenge of maintaining public trust and confidence in these complex technologies is who are the people that are the real experts. There's no commercial nuclear industry in Idaho. So, who are the people in Idaho? Obviously the lab employees, the DOE employees, they live here, they're part of it. But a partnership with an entity in the state, if for no other reason than an observer kind of status, in particularly the safety analysis work, and probabilistic risk assessment, which makes, the average citizen's eyes glaze over. If there are people in the state who, we sit through those discussions. So, and to me, again, I always come back to the universities. So as you look forward, at not only on this project, but other, exciting new reactor projects, is there, because of its role, a special partnership that should be developed, in this case, between the licensing authority, that would be you, and the state, to give people within the state more insight and understanding as to what you're doing? I don't think there's any precedent for it that I know of, but I'm not sure why we shouldn't do that.
Admiral, that's an excellent suggestion. We'll investigate it. I'll be talking to Tom and Tom and our bosses about that. Again, an excellent suggestion. We do interact frequently with the universities, as Dr. Snyder is aware. But I think an increased interaction would be very useful. I will make one comment, though. Under this You mentioned OSHA. Under this administration, there's been a lot of effort on regulatory reform, and I've been a part of numerous working groups on regulatory reform within DOE, and we've actually looked at the efficiency of converting to OSHA on the site, and we worked with SLAC, one of the other labs, and effectively we didn't see, and the lab agreed with us, we didn't see any efficiency gain or, matter of fact, potentially a decrease in safety. So we think our industrial safety, industrial hygiene oversight is adequate at the right level. But your first suggestion, a regulatory interface with the state, is a great idea. Thank you.
If nothing else, then thank you, panel. I think it was a very helpful discussion. I'll now welcome up our panelists for the discussion on microreactors. So thanks, Tom. Thanks, John. Thanks, Bob. So now I'm joined by Shannon Bragg-Sitton from the Idaho National Lab and John Wagner from the Idaho National Lab. And we're going to talk to you about microreactors. I would like to thank Director Tippett for teeing up this session with his questions earlier in the morning. Just by way of framing, I know many of you either were on the visit out to the site yesterday or have been there previously, and so of course you've heard this morning about the 52 reactors that have been built over the years on the INL site. Of course, the 4 that are still in operation out there. And back when a few years ago, when I was in the federal government in the energy department, and we saw the growing interest in investing in nuclear energy innovation and in private firms that are actually trying to bring new nuclear technologies to market, it became apparent to Mark Peters and I and others that there was going to be a need for what we then called National Reactor Testing Station 2.0, right? A place where these innovators could come to demonstrate their products, where you had the infrastructure, you had the expertise to actually support those sorts of demonstrations. That concept grew legs and was actually embodied in legislation that was passed. They changed the name. It's the National Reactor Innovation Center. Do I have that right? Okay. NRIC, because we have to have an acronym for everything, right? And that's something that DOE and the lab and other parts of the lab complex are talking about. Now how to implement. I think folks sort of recognize it. It really needs to be centered here. You got a briefing from John back in was that January Line Commission meeting on this concept. So just to sort of take you back to that discussion. This conversation today about microreactors is just one of several examples of things that could manifest as a result of the INL returning to its historic mission as a place where people come to demonstrate new nuclear energy technologies. So like I did with the first panel, I'm going to ask Shannon and John to just introduce yourselves briefly and talk about kind of how'd you get here and what's your role in this microreactor opportunity.
Thank you, John, and thank you for welcoming me here and giving me this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing in this space. I've been at INL just over 8 years now. My career before getting here focused a lot on space nuclear systems, working with both Los Alamos and NASA in developing what you might think of as nanoreactors, essentially, and how we would utilize those either for power and propulsion in flight or for remote surfaces. And so that's how I came into this microreactor program and was asked about 1.5 years ago to help stand up that program on behalf of the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy. So have been working on that quite a bit and have now passed off that leadership to my colleague Jess Gian, who couldn't be here with us today. But many of you also heard me speak last time at the January Line Commission meeting on integrated energy systems and how that relates to the UAMPS and NuScale project. And that also is a factor within these microreactor systems that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about a little bit is that these are more than just for power, but they bring opportunity for a lot of energy services to remote areas. So this offers an integration of these two very significant efforts within the laboratory, and I look forward to discussing those.
Good morning. I'm John Wagner. I'm the Associate Laboratory Director here for Nuclear Science and Technology. So essentially all the nuclear energy research programs come in through my directorate, and then we work with our colleagues at the Materials and Fuels Complex, which some of you toured yesterday, and the Advanced Test Reactor in terms of implementing these programs. So as we talk about microreactors, as we talk about the National Reactor Innovation Center, it really involves the entire site, but a lot of the research programs for that will come in through my directorate. I've actually had the opportunity to talk to you a couple other times, so let me just mention that for context. So I talked to you in January about the National Reactor Innovation Center, and I talked to you all, whether it was September or October, I don't remember, about the high-assay LEU program, so we might get that vectored into this discussion as well, as I think all of the microreactor concepts that I'm familiar with do intend to utilize high-assay LEU, so I'll plant that seed maybe for a question. And then a little bit about my background. So I'm a nuclear engineer all the way through. All my degrees are in nuclear engineering. I'm a nuclear energy guy. I came to this laboratory about 3 years ago. What brought me to this laboratory was the mission. I was at another national laboratory that did a lot of nuclear research, did good nuclear research, but wasn't focused on, the mission of the laboratory wasn't centered around nuclear energy. So it became evident that I needed to be at this laboratory to pursue what I want to do with the rest of my career. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks. So for starters, and we heard a little bit about this morning, but I think it bears repeating. So what is a microreactor, right? So people here, in particular, the SMR has been part of the conversation here for years. What are the differences?
Sure, I'll start, and please add, John. A microreactor is something that is typically on the order of megawatt scale. These are designed to be very easily transportable, that would utilize components that can be made in a factory. We can fully assemble these in a factory, such that then they can be easily shipped to site in a fully assembled system. So we might use a truck, rail, barge, or even a plane to get those to a remote location, so that we have a much more streamlined approach to building these systems, minimal site preparation at the end use location, making this much simpler to deploy to multiple remote areas, whether those be for industrial applications, remote mining activities, military installations, or perhaps even residential, providing heat and power, as well as clean water, synthetic fuels, things like that, to remote communities as well. These systems also are designed to be essentially self-regulating, very passive in their operation, simple controls. If we look to where this started in the space program, these are designed to be autonomous systems. When we bring these to the terrestrial applications, we tend to talk about semi-autonomous, making these much simpler to operate. You might think of this akin to a self-driving car, but in a much simpler fashion, in that we want to get them up to power, and they'll run at power and deliver their heat and electricity as needed to those microgrid applications or other distributed energy applications in a particular region.
Maybe I'll just add a couple points to that. So the microreactor is sort of an emerging opportunity, emerging area related to some applications. I'm sure we're going to talk about what the applications are in a little bit more detail. But they kind of go in the opposite direction of where the traditional nuclear energy development has gone. If you look back over the years, we tended to go bigger, working economies of scale, from starting out with initial commercial reactors in the 100 megawatt, couple hundred megawatt range, which are now called small modular reactors, up to well over a gigawatt electric. So 3 gigawatts thermal, kind of roughly speaking. So we kept getting more and more power density out of these systems, in some ways making them more complex in larger construction projects. I'm sure all of you have some familiarity with the new builds that are going on in Georgia right now, and just what a massive construction project, massive project generally that is. This is going in the complete opposite direction of that. Moving, as Shannon already noted, moving away from any kind of significant on-site construction to something that would just simply be delivered and set up. And so very different kind of business model. You're taking the capital risk and uncertainty almost out of the equation if it can be achieved. So very, very different model. Also, maybe it's just not as clear to all of you, but very low power density. So the types of safety systems that are required are completely different. The types of potential for any kind of release of radioactive material, completely different kind of situation, which would enable these kinds of remote applications, remote or autonomous control, basically enable some of these features that Shannon spoke of. And so potentially a very, very different future for nuclear energy. Also, I wanted to comment on the size. I don't think any of us like the terminology microreactor, but the issue that we have there is small modular reactor was already taken. Small modular reactors are in the order of a few hundred megawatts or less, is traditionally accepted definition. But these things are not micro. They're not tiny like my phone. These things would probably be more in the order of, if you think about the enclosure of these tables, something that could fit within these tables. So just to give you some kind of scale on that. So we're kind of stuck with the microreactor terminology. Well, until somebody comes up with something better, I suppose. Very small modular reactors are also terminology you'll see, particularly in the DoD documentation. Then maybe I'll just stop there. I don't want to go too far.
And so to your point about the lower power density, so am I accurate in describing it like, so maybe this is something that's the 10th the size or 100th the size of a commercial reactor, but it's 1,000 times lower in terms of power output, right? So you have much less power sort of per unit volume, so it's easier to make the safety case. Is that a good way of looking at it?
That's a very good way to look at it.
Okay. All right. And then in terms of size, many of the folks here, myself included, have paid a visit. I see Doug Sayer in the audience, right, down to Premier Technology. I mean, this is the sort of size you could envision manufacturing in a facility of that scale. Is that the type of thing we're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that was a quick answer. All right. So we've heard about interest in microreactors for a number of years, and Shannon, you talked about space applications in the past, but it seems like interest is really picking up lately. So what's driving that?
So a couple things are driving that. One is interest from remote communities, particularly in the North American area. So that drove some of the companies in terms of their business model to get involved in this area. And then actually, as more attention on that was received, remote communities in other parts of the world, remote mining, some of these other applications started evaluating, hey, could this make sense for what we're doing? And these are basically areas where currently you're using diesel fuel, and so now you're not competing with in a market with natural gas, but you're competing in a market with diesel fuel, and to amplify that, a market with diesel fuel that's transported in maybe only 1 or 2 times a year is the opportunity to make those transports. So reliable, continual energy over a long period of time without refueling is a premium. It's worth quite a premium, and so that's where these types of systems start making sense. I'll note, because I don't think it was said before, most of these designs are typically looked at being able to run without refueling for 10 or more years. So in some applications, that's a significant advantage. Now, what's driving the interest, what's really ticked the interest up an order of magnitude, if you will, is the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense has been looking at these systems on and off for a number of years. In fact, they were involved in some of the systems that were demonstrated on this site many years ago. But more recently, they've expressed direct and tangible interest, particularly through the Strategic Capabilities Office of the Department of Defense, issuing an RFI followed by a request for proposed solutions. So that's gotten the reactor developers' attention, and I would say increased the number of entrants, private entrants in the microreactor space quite substantially.
Very good. So, given that interest, I mean, what sort of timelines are we talking about here, and what are you envisioning in terms of kind of the licensing process that would be involved in environmental review? You know, if this sort of thing were to come to Idaho.
I'll go ahead and start on that. If you go out and look at all the vendors developing microreactor concepts, and you look at the deadlines and the timelines being established by DoD, most of these are starting to talk about demonstrating within 3 to 5 years. So very rapid turnaround, something that we could see demonstrated here on the site or other facility in the very near term. The process for licensing of these systems could be varied depending on the actual application. So John talked about a lot of the commercial type of application, remote mining, community support. Those systems would likely be NRC licensed, and therefore an initial system that was aimed toward that eventual commercial application would follow an NRC licensing path. Some, however, talk about a demonstration system that would have a significant R&D component, perhaps demonstrated out here on the site facilities. That could be a DOE license, a DOE R&D system that could provide significant amount of data for later application in the next generation system. And then we can get into the military applications, and the licensing process may be varied there as well. We hear a lot of interest from the Air Force in looking at fixed installations and having a commercial entity coming up and deploying that initial microreactor on a military base, providing that reliable, secure power to those base facilities, but operated by that commercial entity. Now that, even though it would be a DoD application, that would be an NRC license. However, John also mentioned the Strategic Capabilities Office interest. Now, some of their interest is focused a bit more on mobile systems that might come and first be deployed at one location to operate for some period of time and then be moved to another location. That's a different system that might be classified under a DoD license. We're looking at potential crosswalks across those 3 different regulatory regimes, but it really depends on what the ultimate application is. John, you mentioned questions on siting, environmental evaluations. We're undergoing a number of evaluations of the site right now to support the other areas of activity with the UAMPS project and the carbon-free power project that is planned for the site facilities. Much of what we do to characterize potential locations there will apply to VTR and to microreactors. We're looking at potential demonstration sites within the EBR2 dome or on a greenfield site. So many of these activities will be supportive of one another as we move forward in those processes, moving toward hopefully demonstration of multiple reactor concepts.
Maybe I'll just add on the time frame aspect of that question. Depending on what you read and what you see, there's a lot of aggressive timelines being discussed in terms of demonstrating these systems. Timelines that make some people scratch their heads. You know, is that really possible? Is that really viable? And that's a good discussion point on itself. But let me feed that a little bit and tell you the kind of the critical elements that affect the timing. Because we're very much focused on working on those. One is access to the high-assay LEU, okay? So we're doing a number of things. Bob Boston referred to a couple of them with respect to preparing high-assay LEU. So that's the basic fuel material. Then you have to fabricate fuel, okay? So that takes specialized facilities and equipment to do that. It takes some time to set that up, to do the fuel fabrication. So those are both what I would call critical path items that the laboratory is working on. Then there's licensing, which Shannon just talked about that. Two different kind of categories of options, whether that's a DOE authorization or an NRC licensing, depending on the use and intent of the system to be authorized. So those 3 things, the high-assay LEU, the fuel fabrication, and the licensing are ultimately going to dictate the schedule. And of course, funding to do those things is overlaid. But I just wanted to comment on that.
Very good. And on that subject of fuel, one just an observation for folks. You know, we talked about that Department of Defense solicitation and the fact that they've required use of this TRISO fuel, that the INL played such an important role in pioneering and evolving. I think that's a testament to the good work that's been done here. But you've touched a couple times on the issue of high assay LEU, and that of course is something that is not commercially available in the U.S. right now. You want to touch dig a little bit deeper on things that the lab and the broader DOE system are doing to try to ensure that that fuel material is available, and how that might touch on Idaho?
Absolutely. So there's several different ways, I mean, for context, that you can get high assay LEU. So you can traditionally, you would enrich it. You enrich natural uranium up as high as you sort of need. Now we're talking about roughly 28%. So that's one mechanism. The Department of Energy is entering into a contract with a private company called Centrus to establish or demonstrate that capability. Then the private sector would go from there. So basically, they're trying to get the private sector to where they can show that they can do it, and then the market would take it from there. Is kind of the plan. Another way, which is the suspected way, I'll say it that way because I don't know for certain, that the Department of Defense would get high assay LEU material for their initial demonstrations, would be to take existing high enriched uranium and downblend it with natural or depleted uranium. So you're taking it now down in enrichment, down to this 28%. And that's probably the fastest source of high assay LEU available in any kind of significant quantities. And then the methods, maybe the third class of method, is to recover high enriched uranium from spent high enriched uranium material and then downblend it to 28% or whatever you're looking for. And so we have a few sources of that. Right now we've been actively working on, as I think was mentioned this morning, processing the spent EBR2 fuel material. So we separate the uranium from the rest of the material and then downblend that. So we've been doing that for years. As was noted earlier, that was being done to create a waste form that was no longer HEU, and then that waste form would be disposed. Now, as a nuclear guy, I'm going, this should never have been considered waste. It should have been considered valuable material, and it looks like we're actually going to use it for future reactors. And then there's a number of other sources. I won't go into them, but certainly like ATR fuel when it's discharged is still high enriched uranium. The naval reactor fuel when it's discharged still has a lot of uranium content. So there are a variety of other fuel materials that could also be used in that way. And we're doing research to look at a couple different approaches, one focused on the EBR2 material and another approach focused on potentially naval or ATR fuel.
Great. Thanks. With that, Madam Chair, that sort of tees it up. I thought we'd then turn to the Commission for questions. Sorry.
I have one. Thank you, that was very interesting. So John, this is actually for you, as we just heard two presentations on some really amazing things that could potentially be happening right here in Idaho. And you talk about what DOE is trying to do to get us to that level. What could the state be doing to help advance these projects?
Just for clarity, which John?
Either.
Go ahead. Well, I mean, one, continuing the Line Commission, I think is a huge help because it helps really explore the opportunity that exists. I can't help but look back on my experience as part of the first Line Commission and the time we spent looking at things like the SMR opportunity, which the state has picked up the ball, run with, and enacted some policies to help create a demand pull, create an environment that is more conducive to SMR development in the state. So I think that's huge. As you go through your work, identifying opportunities like that, I think is going to be, I think can be very valuable to attracting new activity, new nuclear energy development in the state. One of the things that we're noticing from my perch at the Nuclear Energy Institute now, right? So we concern ourselves a lot with both federal policy and with what's going on at the state level. You may recall when I last spoke to you in January, we talked about some of the challenges facing nuclear plants around the country and action states are taking to ensure that they retain those nuclear plants, keep them in operation. There are several drivers for that. Of course, jobs, local economic activity, and tax base are high among them. But also the fact that nuclear is far and away our largest source of clean energy generation in the United States. And for an increasing number of companies around the country and around the world, accessing increasingly clean electricity supply is a commitment they're making, right, to themselves, their shareholders, and their customers. And so companies like HP, Chobani, Cliff Bar here, in Idaho, but it's not just it's Walmart, it's McDonald's, it's Hilton. I mean, all manner of companies are wanting to access an increasing share of clean energy generation. The fact that energy generation in Idaho, or electricity generation in Idaho, is already so clean, I think is part of the reason why the state has been successful in attracting some of these companies. I think the more you go down the path through things like new nuclear development, but also increased deployment of renewables, other things that you might bring to the state, I think that's going to make the state more economically attractive. Other states are taking action through things like clean energy standards or through other incentives to try to create that environment that will be attractive to companies that are looking to build, expand, relocate, what have you. I think there are opportunities in that area that you all might consider looking at. In addition to the more traditional things that you've done, the state has been very good in the past about, for example, looking at tax incentives, right, to help attract. I think those things will always want to be part of the toolkit. But I think, sort of building on what we've seen coming out of Idaho Power and their commitment to going increasingly clean, I think the state is in a position to preserve the competitive advantage it already enjoys by helping to bring new nuclear development into the state. So that's a thought. I'm sure there are others, but that's anything else from the panel?
Well, if I could add just a little bit, I certainly agree with everything that John Kochik just said. I'll just note that there is no microreactor supply chain currently. There is no factory where microreactors are currently made. There is no fuel fabrication set up to support microreactors. There's not currently a supply chain for high-assay LEU. So these are all opportunities that exist now because if the future for microreactors is what I certainly think it should be and will be, these things will get created somewhere. And the question is, what or should any of those be created here in the state of Idaho? And so that's, so the point there is that this opportunity is there, and we'll see who takes it, if you will. The fact that we have 89 or 890 square miles of space here, and the ability to allow private companies to come and use that space and create such factories and facilities, that's an opportunity. What could this group or the state do? I think John talked about that already. But stakeholder engagement to communicate the potential opportunities here, and it's not just around microreactors. There's obviously a huge opportunity around all clean energy technologies. This is just one of those. And then both, we're certainly focused on at the laboratory, but beyond, when you start looking at the supply chain, is focused workforce development. A lot of times a company will go to a certain location for certain attributes that they're looking for, and I think you all know this. One might be tax incentives. Where's the cheapest thing? One might be access to a distribution center where they can ship out their product to their customer, and another is resident talent pool. So if we had the talent pool here, that would be an attractor to some of these markets. And I have a few other ideas, but I'll stop there.
I think Director Tippett and then Director Keeley have questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. A question for any of the panelists. Certainly intriguing and exciting to consider the possibility of small reactors that can be located in remote communities. And I appreciated the information you gave us related to the safety of because of the design and process and the nature of the fuel of the reactors. My question, though, is I wonder if we're creating the potential for intentional acts of sabotage by terrorist organizations, for example, by putting nuclear reactors in remote locations. Certainly that wouldn't be as much an issue in my mind with the Department of Defense. But if we're using it, for example, for residential power generation in remote locations, could you characterize for me the nature of the potential for a significant environmental issue to be created intentionally by someone wanting to not just remove the source of the power, but to create a contamination issue in a remote area?
Yeah, certainly. So first, I guess the overarching comment would be that these systems will not be deployed unless they meet safety, security, and non-proliferation standards as their regulator, for example, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So there are a number of issues with how are we going to protect the safety and the security of these systems. And so I guess my point is that they will be worked through or they will not be licensed and deployed. And the standards for the NRC for security and safeguards have been very effective. One of the features or that's an advantage to trying to meet these types of objectives is that when you look at the radioactive source term in these systems, I know it's kind of hard maybe to get your head around, but it's incredibly small. The ability, you simply don't have much material to try to spread around or to cause harm with. And maybe to try to give some perspective, right now we have spent fuel casks at spent fuel installations. In fact, we have some of them out at Intech. You might have driven by some of them yesterday. The resident amount of source term in a spent fuel cask is at least an order of magnitude more than what would be in these small reactors. And we've been properly, safely securing those systems all over the country for years. So I don't mean to dismiss it. It's an important factor, especially if we start thinking about international deployment. But we have regulations in place, and the systems will have to meet those regulations, and I think those regulations are effective.
Thank you. And I'd like to go a little further on that the market size, the addressable market size, and the product segment itself. Approximately how large is this in terms of units per year in the U.S. or abroad as you've looked at it? What's the range of cost or selling prices that you're looking at for these so that you get a sense of the size of content for a manufacturer for the supply chain parts that go into this? And are we in Idaho, it seems like we're well positioned by being close to the lab and the sort of the source of the technology. Is the supply chain starting to form yet? Is it well known what the contents will be, what it will look like, and yet are we behind as a state, or are we cutting edge?
I'll start, and I don't have answers to all of your questions because I think we're right at the cusp. We're right at the beginning of this, and a lot of the developers working in this space are trying to get their hands around that market size and that market potential right now as we speak. Because the comparison point for these potential applications is not what the price of electricity is here in a developed region, but is instead that diesel genset that has to have diesel delivered to those locations. We can start looking at market size based on those types of communities that are currently reliant on that and look at price points there. The price point for levelized cost of electricity for these microreactors will be higher than something we would put here in our communities because the comparison point is very, very different. I hesitate to put a number on that right now because that's currently a number that's in development. But I don't think we're too late. We are right there at that forefront of this. A lot of these companies are coming to INL for technical support, for support in developing fuel materials, in looking at transportation of these systems. And I think the opportunity has been put before us that we should be starting to take in a number of different areas.
Okay, I'll try to get into some of these things. So NEI recently put out a study, by the way, looking at the market, and not to defer to that, but there's some information out there. But what we're now seeing is a number of different private companies, investors in these potential private companies and organizations like NEI, and even to a certain degree us, looking at what does this market really look like. So people are getting their heads around that right now. The market for these systems is going to depend obviously on the cost. So in certain places in the country, in Alaska and remote Canada, you can be $1 a kilowatt hour and be competitive. Okay, so that's kind of incredible when you think about that kind of cost, right? As you drive that cost down, your market share or market opportunity increases quite significantly. And so that's where demonstration of these systems and R&D to drive the cost down is going to make a big difference on, do these systems ultimately just get deployed for DoD, for example, where the cost point is quite high, particularly for transportable, or do they become really mainstream to where instead of looking up on the hillside, you see 150 or so windmills, we have 150 microreactors deployed in different areas together, not so dispersed, but so that's where our demonstration becomes so important in terms of, first of all, seeing that we can do it. We haven't had a lot of success rate in demonstrating new nuclear reactors lately, so that's an important aspect of it. But then the R&D to drive these things down. In order for these things to be cost competitive in a big market, we're going to have to work on remote or autonomous control. You can't afford to have a big control staff and so forth around these systems. We're going to have to work on driving down the cost of high-assay LEU and other parts of the supply chain. So we'll see. Right now, I think there's a lot of confidence that they're competitive in these remote markets where the price of energy is very, very high. And it remains to be seen how big this market is. I personally think the market could be quite substantial.
Just one more thing I'd like to add that I think we neglected to address part of your question with regard to, do we know what these components look like? Do we know what that need is within those factories? We haven't really talked about the reactor types that fall into this category, but they look very, very different from current fleet or SMRs that are on the forefront. We're looking at things like heat pipe cooled reactors that use liquid metals inside of a heat pipe. We're looking at gas cooled systems, liquid metal cooled systems. There's a number of vendors out there developing potential designs in each of these areas. So it's hard to answer that question right now because we could end up with multiple concepts out there being demonstrated that have different supply chain needs, but yet also have some commonalities. And so all of that is still being worked out, and we'll see what begins to fall out as we go through the levels of R&D and demonstration.
Mayor Casper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm always interested in thinking about how Idaho's work, and in this case, I guess the opportunities that we're facilitating here, how it fits into the bigger national and the global picture. Last week, we learned that Exelon is going to be closing down the 3 Mile Island plant this coming September. And this is, I think, kind of bad news for those employees, and it's also bad news for the nation's fleet. But I'm trying to work out sort of the big picture nationally, and understand how these new and emerging technologies will be impacted by developments in the industry like closures. And so I'm kind of thinking nationally right now, but there may be some international components to my question here. But it strikes me that a very key moment is emerging where the kinds of technologies that are being developed and demonstrated in Idaho we will be well poised to take advantage of this moment in history or in time that's developing. Can you, just given your unique vantage point here, talk a little bit about the impact of maybe something like a closure, which creates ripple effects with the fleet and with capacity? And we know when something closes, when a plant closes, we know, for example, that emissions tend to go up as that base load is replaced with something else. And so all of those increased emissions obviously creates an opportunity for nuclear. Do you see where microreactors might plug in some of that? Or what's the big picture looking like? The applications you've described are so exciting. So.
Go ahead.
So just absolutely, it's concerning when we see current fleet plants shutting down before they're license expires. This is concerning to the nuclear industry. It's concerning to those that are looking at environment and emissions and things like that. So that is absolutely something we need to keep a parallel path on in looking to ways to keep those facilities economically viable, which is why we are doing so much work with current fleet plants and integrated energy systems. How do we produce other commodities, not just electricity, but support other needs and applications, hydrogen, steel manufacturing, ammonia production, things like that. So that's one path that we are very focused on within the laboratory. But if we look at how some of that is coming about and what the challenges are, in some cases, it's in some regions, it's because we have more and more renewables coming on the grid, more distributed generation coming on the grid. When we look at current nuclear technology, we have very large-scale centralized systems. And if we begin looking at where we could move in nuclear technologies, small modular reactors, microreactors, a much more distributed energy system, these can be coupled with renewables and be complementary to renewables in a much easier way than some of the large-scale systems. So many of these are also being designed to be more flexible in their operation and therefore work hand in hand with these renewables that operate variably and provide that backbone, that base load generation to provide the secure, resilient, reliable energy that we need in these communities, not just for electricity, but for other applications as well. And so I think that's a huge area that we need to make sure that as we develop new technologies, it's not with that old thinking of we're just producing electricity, but we're using the heat. We're using everything that that asset has to offer to meet the needs of our growing communities.
Just to add to that a little bit, in addition to the environmental and economic and employment impacts of losing plants, I do worry about just the narrative. Right, it's a really exciting time to be in nuclear right now. All right, there's all this great stuff going on, whether it's the SMRs or the microreactors or things like VTR, and you've got dozens of companies out there investing private capital and trying to bring new nuclear technologies to market. And maybe you're a student. We got some here from the University of Michigan today, right? Maybe you're a student that's getting into this, and you're like, well, that sounds really exciting, and I just read that another reactor's closing, right? I mean, where's this industry headed? So I think it's a concern from that perspective as well, and the more that we can show that there actually really is a bright future here. To Shannon's point, the role that nuclear can play as more states, as more companies, as more countries commit to going to a much lower carbon energy system, the role nuclear can play in providing that backbone for the grid. Right? When you think about what are the zero carbon options available for large-scale electricity supply today, all right, that's 24/7. It's nuclear. It can be hydro in certain applications, geothermal, but that's a limited resource, right? Maybe we get to fossil fuel with carbon capture and sequestration. Yeah, batteries and heat storage and hydrogen production, those will get more cost-effective, but they'll still be significantly more expensive than where nuclear is today. So there's really a compelling role for nuclear going forward. We just have to sort of get that message to break through some of these challenges that we're having right now.
Just a quick observation. As I think about maybe some international applications, even more than national ones, do you think the affordability of the microreactors will be such that we could, I'm thinking about the energy-water nexus, that they could be deployed and not used for power, for commercial power or people's power, but used to power desalination plants and really change, people's lives in that way? Is that an affordable application?
We're doing those studies right now. And absolutely, I think in other countries, these systems probably have more of an opportunity than they do here in the U.S. Yes, we have regions like Alaska and some island nations where they could help, or islands that are part of the U.S. But I think in the international space, they have even more opportunity to provide that clean supply, that reliable supply for those basic needs of the communities. We're working with several plants right now in the U.S. operating, looking at alternate applications. One is looking at large-scale desalination. We're also talking with other countries about desalination applications, and these would be nuclear newcomer states, those that don't have nuclear right now that are working toward establishing that reliable source of nuclear, and desalination is a top option for some of those. I'll also mention an effort that started about a year ago now under the Clean Energy Ministerial. So this is a ministerial level effort. About 30 countries, I believe, are a part of that ministerial. And at last year's meeting in May of 2018, we launched the Nuclear Innovation Clean Energy Future Initiative. And as a part of that, looking at nuclear as the largest clean energy provider that can be an option for some of these newcomer nations or some of these nations that currently have very limited nuclear applications. We're looking at integrated energy systems or hybrid systems as a primary technical aspect of that initiative. We have a number of countries that have specifically joined that initiative and are working with us to take the steps at what does that look like in each country, what are the challenges, what are the needs, how can nuclear best fit that need hand in hand with renewables. So I'm really excited about this initiative and how we can bring these other countries along in developing these systems. Another aspect of it is the communications piece. We have some of the non-technical pieces, policy, communications, how do these play into the potential to deploy nuclear in these countries? So we're working with a number of governments in that to understand what that looks like across the different countries and how we can help as a strong nuclear nation.
Rose?
Okay, so understanding this in terms of like how much one of these micro reactors how much power they can supply. I heard you say a megawatt. Is it megawatt or megawatts? You know, like what could one of these do?
That varies, and I tried to put a number to it and did not get agreement among the community. So I'll say that 5 to 10 megawatts might be a standard size. We see some companies developing these on the order of half a megawatt up to 15 megawatts. Really what constrains them is can they meet the other requirements for transportability, ease of transportability, factory manufacture, so that we don't have on-site builds and some of the challenges associated with that. And so more than just that power level, it's how do they meet the other requirements. But 10 megawatts electric is kind of a midpoint that I would give.
Maybe if I could just add to that, a number of the concepts are just a couple of megawatts. And as they get maturity in designs and so forth, they'll do all they can to push that up within the constraints that Shannon mentioned and get as much power for as long as possible. That's where your business model will take over. But don't think about these things as just, oh, this is a 2 megawatt system and I need 10 megawatts, so it's not a viable system. Because we could very much see a future where you need 10 megawatts, you order 5 of these things, and you just add them as you need them. The scalability of these kind of systems could be a very, a game changer in certain applications.
In terms of size again, did you mean like would fit in the middle of these tables, or I guess I just misunderstood that part? Yes, I did. So think about a rail car. Think about the back of a pretty significant 18-wheeler. That's what really constrains. That's what really defines this class of reactors more so than power. Shannon mentioned difficulty. They've been tried to define as 20 megawatts to 2 megawatts and all these things. But really the definition is, can I make this thing in a factory completely, ship it to site, and I'm assembling, not constructing. I might be adding a couple pieces together. That really drives the classification of this, and people don't like that. They want to put a number on it. Is it 10 megawatts or is it 20? Is it 2? But that's just what it is.
Just one additional point on that. When we talk about being inside here, that's with shielding. We're talking about putting shielding around that. So think about that mobile concept that I mentioned for some of the military applications where you might operate it at point A, pack it up, let it cool off for a week, and then ship it to point B. You've got to ship that with shielding. And so you're putting it on the back of a truck or a rail car, and it's got shielding with it. And so that's the kind of size we're talking about.